Welcome to the Aviate with Ananya podcast, where we explore the world of aviation through stories of pilots, enthusiasts, and industry leaders. In this episode, we are thrilled to be joined by Lynn Darnell, well known as Lucky Lindy, a member of the 99ers local EEA chapter, and pilot for many decades.
Thank you for having me, Emma. This is great. I love telling these stories.
Yeah. Lindy has a wealth of experience and insights to share with us today, and we can't wait to dive into his story. To start off, can you please give us a brief background of your experiences in aviation?
I think I literally came out of the womb airborne. Both parents were pilots before the war, before World War II, during World War II. We'll get to more of that later. And then they flew together for 55 years after the war. So the nickname Lucky Lindy was kind of a given. Their respective heroes were Charles A. Lindbergh, the original Lucky Lindy, and of course Amelia Earhart on my mom's side. We had a family plane, a 180, which I'll show you a picture of when we get to that section. It was a great deal of fun. Had big oversized tires on it, could land and take off anywhere. Flew it all over the country, mostly up into the mountains to go fishing. And if you want to talk about the 180, we'll do that later. Started taking, my parents were great coaches, so I had the fundamentals down, and ended up taking my flying lessons in the early 80s. Completely different scenario from today as I'm learning, and was taking flying lessons to get proficient in a small fixed wing tail dragger called a Balanca Champ. Maybe some of your listeners are familiar with it. It was the original trainer, very much like a J3 Cub. Went on through to the 152, the 172, ended up flying with a friend of mine in a Beech Baron, a twin engine. So I got some twin engine time, and then I quit. Life got in the way, and it was 20 years before I picked it up again, and then another 20 years to the present day. I've had some great experiences at the airport that I've told you a little bit about.
Yeah. You mentioned when we spoke earlier that both of your parents flew for the U.S. Army Air Force during the war and as general aviation pilots as well. And additionally, your mother was a WASP pilot. It's an honor. So what was it like growing up in a family of pilots, and how did it influence your interest in aviation?
It was just part of life. We flew recreationally, as I was mentioning, to go places, to go fishing. Fly fishing was important. We took the back seat out of the 180, put the two golden retrievers back there, put a rod case all the way back to the back of the fuselage, and went up to go fly fishing, typically off horseback. My dad, being a proficient pilot, he was an engineer and was checking out job sites and construction sites all over the country, and we would jump in the plane and go check these things out in general aviation. Spent a lot of time in my business in the later years flying commercials, so I've logged quite a few hours both sides. He was an engineer, so I also enjoyed working on the airplanes. Got a great deal of mechanical expertise through him.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so all through your life, just like how people go on road trips in their cars, you were out here going on road trips in your airplane. That's a really cool experience.
You mentioned the road trips and flying. I'll never forget a time up in Colorado. We had what a headwind is versus a tailwind. You've had some great flying experiences yourself. I'll never forget one flight. We had a headwind right on the nose of the 180. And even at full throttle, I look down and I see bicycles passing us below. That's how stiff that headwind was.
Yeah.
After a blizzard years later, we were coming in from Montana after a hunt, and we picked up a tailwind and crossed over Montana, Colorado, and Kansas about the same time it took us to get up there in the first place.
Talking about your childhood plane and all the memories you've created in it, could you tell us about your favorite memory?
Oh, without a doubt, just the opportunity to go places and not have to be in a car. We would go to sporting events. I'll never forget a trip to New Orleans to see my alma mater play football. The air traffic control in New Orleans was a little bit lax that day, and I'll never forget it. We were on final approach to an airport that literally ran right out into Lake Pontchartrain, and the controller just left us. And we're circling and we're circling and we're circling, and the gas is getting a little low. Finally, they came back on. If you've ever heard a Cajun accent, thank goodness my daddy was a Louisiana boy, he could understand it.
So Lindy here is a businessman, and I've heard many things about his endeavors in aerial photography as well. What inspired you to start the first aerial photography company in Austin, and what were some of the challenges you faced?
This was back in the late 70s. I'd graduated from college. I'd worked for my dad's engineering firm. The man thought the babies were switched at birth. I did not have the background to be an engineer, the math, the science. I was a mama's boy. I really took after my mom. So this was about 1977, and I just was not cut out to be a suit sitting in an office building all day. A friend of mine was a great photographer. He knew that we had a plane. We used my dad's plane in the beginning. It was opportunity. Austin, Texas was exploding in the late 70s, early 80s. So we would rent a plane. Dad took us up on our first few, and then he got tired of us as businessmen. So we'd rent a plane and go up, and Rob, my partner, would open the window to the starboard side and hang out of the airplane with the camera to shoot aerial photography. Nobody else was doing it. And we had all these developers moving in from California and other cities. They needed aerial photos of the land they were going to develop. It was a built-in economy for a couple of young entrepreneurs. We had the dark room in his apartment. Do you even know what a dark room is? I bet you don't.
I have a brief understanding, but yeah, it's
That was back in the print days before we
yeah.
had cameras. So I ran the business from my upstairs apartment, and Rob would do all the developing in the lower unit. It was a great opportunity until everybody else got in the game.
Mhm. Yeah. Talking about your formal flight experience in San Marcos in the 80s, what was your favorite aircraft to fly and why?
I started out and still love. Unfortunately, that airplane ended up getting totaled. It was a Belanca 7ECA. It would remind you a great deal of a Cub in terms of the size of it, the engine power. I think it had a 160 horse engine, no flaps. You learn to fly with stick and rudder. And to me, that is the way to learn how to fly. Plus, it's a tail dragger, which really tests you. My parents were so elitist, they insisted that I learn to fly a tail dragger first. They called a fixed gear, standard gear training wheels. That's how little they thought of a traditional tricycle gear.
Mhm.
The plane would jump off the runway with very little use of the runway, highly maneuverable, aerobatically maneuverable. And again, things were changing even back in the 80s in terms of the requirements to learn how to fly. My instructor he was not former military, but he was a commercial airline pilot. We did spins, stalls, everything that the military pilots had to do for years. And that's how you learn how to fly.
Yeah.
It was a great airplane.
Yeah, it's really
Move
inspiring.
on, like to say the 152s and the 172s because they had more seats. The Belanca, my instructor was behind me, and he had all kinds of fun rattling the stick between my knees when I would mess up a maneuver. And then we'd be over, let's say, Lake Travis or someplace out in the middle of nowhere, and he would kill the engine to see if I was always looking for an emergency landing. And it also taught me how to not panic, restart the engine if it would start, and if not, we would have to set down.
Wow.
I
That's
couldn't
very
see
high stake
anything
moments, man.
last day, but I couldn't see anything that he was doing. He was directly behind me.
Right behind you. Yeah, that really reminds me of one of the airplanes we saw at the air show, which was one of the trainers that the WASPs used during their training out at Sweetwater's.
Right.
And they also had a stick, just a simple four or five instruments and then the stick. And I was talking to the pilot, and it was crazy to see how those vintage type airplanes are still in use today since he flew it down from Corpus Christi. And I just found it so amazing to take a look in the past and just see how far we've come, but also like how important all these olden style planes are to understand.
Those planes were built to last, especially the trainers and the warbirds
Mhm.
in World War II. You had student cadets who'd never flown an aircraft before. They would smash them into the runway. They had to take a lot of abuse. You and I talked about the AT-6 Texan. That's a classic example. There are so many of them still flying today because they were built to last.
Built to last, yeah. So since we're on the topic of World War II and the WASP program, I'd like to talk about your mother and your interest in the WASPs. I actually first spoke to Lindy about my extended essay for IB, talking about the WASP program and all they did for our country. And through our conversations and the 99ers help, Lindy's here with us for an interview. So, talking about your first time flying in the 2000s in your mother's favorite WASP trainer, the AT-6 Texan fighter. What was it like? What was it like to fly the airplane that your mother trained in?
It was beyond a thrill. She always claimed it was her first and last love as a Sweetwater trainee. The AT-6A fighter, pursuit fighter, was the last aircraft that the male and female cadets had to pass a check ride, or even after 6 months of perfect performance, they washed out. So it was an ultimate test. It was a tail dragger. You had inline seating, 600 horsepower in that radial engine.
Mhm.
Go anywhere, anytime, carry a load of any kind. I was first thinking, mother passed in 99. I began thinking about doing some kind of a feature film. There'd never been one done at that point. Right after 9/11, obviously there was not a whole lot of activity in the air. A lady barnstormer from Nashville, Tennessee, called me up. She said, I read about your ideas. I've been to Sweetwater. I think you need to come over here and fly your mother's favorite plane. So I did. We went up, flew down the Cumberland River between Kentucky and Tennessee on a beautiful bluebird day. And she said, are you ready? I said, ready for what? She said, to do your first aerobatics. I took a deep breath, said, sure, why not? I'd flown the plane. She'd got me accustomed to it. She said, now don't break my airplane. She had about 3,000 hours in just this particular type of aircraft. She had bought it from the Spanish Army.
Wow.
And we did rolls and we did chandelles. And finally, we get to the end of the flight. I said, what's your favorite aerobatic maneuver? She said, buckle up. You're already in this parachute harness. I said, what's it called? She said, an avalanche. And we went straight up, stalled, fell over on the backside. So we're looking straight down, and then went into a control spin. What G's we were pulling, but my stomach was up in my throat. I'll never forget that flight. Great supporter. She wanted us to make that. She would have been my lead technician. We just never quite got traction on it, but I haven't given up yet.
Yeah. So talking a lot about the ambitions that you have about sharing your mother's story, can you tell us a bit more about getting her story to the silver screen? I think it's an awesome idea. Have you started getting some fruition to that dream, or is that coming up soon?
You could say that. I started back in about 2001, 2002. There have been 3 documentaries done over that period of time. This is called Fly Girls. It was the first one. I think it was the best one. All 3 are on PBS at some point. There has been talk of a television miniseries called Fly Girls. I gave them some money. I gave them some support. Dozens of scripts. The last one I'd heard about was 3 years ago. They had hired the director, get this, of Hamilton, the blockbuster musical,
Wow.
to direct the play. It was going to be based on a book. That hasn't happened. The last thing I heard last May at the WASP homecoming reunion, Paramount Plus, which is also Peacock, NBC Universal, had found Renee Zellweger to play the role of Jacqueline Cochran, the founder of the WASP. I don't know. I've made contact with these folks, told them I have 20 years of research and storytelling and archives and all kinds of resources that I could give them, from pilots to trainees. It hasn't happened yet. There have been movies about the Tuskegee Airmen. I think you know that story, the Black Flyers who protected the B-17 bombers. There has been a movie about the Navajo code talkers,
Yeah.
who translated from the Japanese code. We just haven't quite pulled it off. It took 33 years for them to get veterans benefits, and it took 60 years to get them the Congressional Gold Medal.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still an untold story, which is why I'm just going to keep on.
Yeah.
There was a good initiative. Do you know what the Commemorative Air Force is? We saw a lot of those people at the air show that you were.
Yes.
Those pilots and a number of those planes were from the commemorative. In fact, the Burn It Wing was one of the sponsors. They started a program. Can you see this okay?
Yes.
They started this program about 5 years ago. It was called the Rise Above WASP. They've done the test. It's an inspirational educational program for young people to get them interested in aviation and also to inspire them.
Yeah.
They put Mother's poster. This is a shot of Mother climbing into a Douglas Dauntless with her parachute on her fanny. And they started this program to go after the Tuskegee program. They made a film. They shot a short film at Sweetwater and built a theater to hold it. It's still, again, getting traction. Very expensive to do all this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one more reason why I thought it was a great idea to write my extended essay about it and to have you on the show to spread some word about it and really bring them the credit that they deserve.
Please let your listeners know to check out the WASP Museum in Sweetwater. It's called the National WASP World War II Museum. It's waspmuseum.org, very short. We are 2 weeks away from the 87th anniversary of the program. They call it Homecoming. It's a 3-day affair, the last weekend in April. Your listeners can check it out on that website. If they can get to Sweetwater, which is not exactly a destination, it would be a great thing to do in terms of your research for your stories. Give it a try.
Yes, I do actually plan to attend, so I'm hoping for a great time.
Great.
And since we're already talking about some of the great inspirations that you have in your life, your father, your mother, you also told me about a dear mentor of yours. Can you share a bit more about Lou and what kind of impact he had on your flying career?
We held a memorial service last night. I'm still a little bit raw. We've been working on it for about a month. Lou DeFazio is about 8 years older than I am. He started out just like I did. We trained in the same plane. He went on to go to Vietnam and fly F-4 Phantoms. Incredible. I think I sent you one of the stories.
Yes.
Was 2 distinguished flying crosses in his time in Vietnam. Took a little back seat for a while, went into business, and then we went into the Gulf War. So he joined the Army. He'd been in the Air Force. He joined the Army and flew medevac helos during Desert Storm. Got back and operated 4 FBOs, and you know what those are, fixed base operations. Went back into flying with Continental Airlines for 18 years until they made him retire at 60.
Yeah.
The next day, get this, I just learned this last night. The next day, they upped the retirement age to 65. He was one upset individual. But that freed him up to become the greatest instructor I've ever worked with. His business card, he ran out of room with the different things he could teach you. If it could fly, Lou could teach you. He came into our lives about 4 years ago here in Fredericksburg, Texas at T-82, our airport. And I was blessed enough, the story I told last night, I'd quit flying. I'd developed a problem in my left eye. It took away my depth perception. Well, that's not real good when you're trying to land. You can imagine. How far off the ground am I? And Lou, I was covering his instruction for one of our student pilots. And he finally said, "What's with you?" He said, "Why aren't you flying?" And I told him the story, kind of a whiny voice. And he said, "Nonsense." Lou DeFazio got me back in the left seat, got me flying again. I am very proud to have his signature in my logbook. He treated every student, whether they were their first lesson all the way to people getting type ratings for commercial. He treated us all the same. He listened well, he asked questions great, and he taught us to fly precision.
Yeah, I'm truly sorry for your loss. He sounds like a very inspiring man and very good friend of yours.
His memory will live on forever. Every time I look upward.
Yeah. So moving on to your most recent endeavors, starting around 2020 after the pandemic, you told me about your involvement with the local EAA chapter and the 99ers. So what are some of the most rewarding experiences that you've gained through those organizations?
Without question, the sponsorship of what is called the Ray Aviation Foundation Scholarship Program. This is a program that goes through EAA National. I think your listeners know EAA stands for Experimental Aircraft Association. These are people who oftentimes build their own planes. And anytime you see experimental across a plane, that's not a bad thing. They're very regulated by the FAA. This gentleman, Mr. Ray, passed away some years ago, and he had already committed a great deal of money to establish an academy up near Oshkosh, Wisconsin, which is where EAA is based. And he decided he was going to do everything to overcome the objection of most young student pilots, and that's the cost. So he put together over $1.5 million per year to distribute through local chapters. The first 2 years I was involved, they were $10,000 scholarships. Costs have continued to rise, as you know. So this year's student that I'm sponsoring is getting an $11,000 scholarship. That's been my motivation to answer your question, for the last 3 years, is finding money for and helping young people get into aviation. The cool thing about the Ray Scholarship, you know the national average across the board, all ages, of people who start and finish to get their privates. Do you know that statistic?
No, sir.
About 20%. After 4 years of the Ray Aviation Scholarship Program, which involves not only the money, but the mentoring, 80%. Huge increase. And
Huge increase.
tells the story why it's not just reading the books, taking the training, flying the simulator, it's having experienced pilots to mentor you through that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great nowadays. I'm also talking to a few young students with similar interests as me in my school itself. Through organizations and glider clubs opening up and more exposure to aviation in general, they're gaining a lot of interest in getting their own private licenses, their drone licenses, gliding experience, and I think the youth of this generation is really going to have a very bright future in aviation.
Absolutely. You asked about I know we're running out of time, but you asked about the 99. I joined them for one simple reason, not just to support youth in aviation, but because they are Sarah Went, whom you met, the chairman of the Austin Hill Country 99s. She is the Energizer Bunny. She has put together more data on scholarships because the percentage of women not only flying, but in A&P, the mechanics, the avionics experts, we need more women in the entire field.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So the 99s are doing a great job. And you've several of their activities.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing everything possible to not only inspire, but to get them through and help them find the money to do it.
Yeah. Well, Lindy, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. Listeners, thank you for listening to the episode. We hope you really enjoyed hearing from Lucky Lindy about his experiences and insights into the world of aviation. If you want to learn more about the 99ers, the WASPs, or any other aviation topic discussed today, please be sure to check out the many links I post below for additional resources. Thank you for tuning, and we'll see you in the skies.